Now, it's getting on for almost 2 months that we've been stuck behind our front doors. Things look like they might change slightly next week, but it's been a long time since we've seen each other in person, long time since we've been able to do the things that we want to do. Very different world, a very different way of life to what you've known, especially, our younger ones in the audience. We're a bit like prisoners under house arrest, aren't we? But if our world feels strange and it feels restricted, just spare a thought for the young people that we're going to spend time with this afternoon in our two studies. These faithful friends spent the whole of their lives in captivity, and the brilliant thing about them is that they stuck together. We're going to see that they had the whole world against them at times, and the lesson they bring us is how important it is that we have friends who believe what we do, especially when it gets tough. So we've got two studies. We've got one with Daniel and then one without Daniel, but the same message comes from both incidents, and that is that when you believe the truth like they did, you really are in it together, and being in it together, as far as the truth goes, brings real benefits. So I hope you've got lots of pencils and pens to write some of this great stuff down, because as I've told some of you before, the safest place to keep this stuff is in your margins or in your notebooks. Don't rely on your grey cells. I can promise you they vanish. Now let's start by making a little comment about how unique the book of Daniel is for us, because if you think about it, most of the Old Testament is about Israel living in Israel, living in an environment where God's laws were supposed to be understood and followed. Now, it didn't always happen that way, but the official religion, if you like, was the law of God. It was the law of Yahweh. Everyone knew about that, even if they didn't follow those laws. But in Daniel, it's entirely different, isn't it? Because the state religion and the laws of Babylon all belong to Nebuchadnezzar and then the other kings who followed him. So there's going to be conflict, isn't there? Because as we'll see, these friends who were led by Daniel, they want to keep God's law, not the king's law. So how's that going to play out? Because these Jews who belonged in the land of Israel find themselves displaced. They've been moved to Babylon. And there's an estrangement between where they want to be and where they are. And the first reason that today's studies are so important to you and me is because we're experiencing the very same thing. We are estranged and displaced too. Not because of COVID-19, but because we don't really belong here. We're estranged and displaced in this world. As comfortable as our houses are and our lives might be at the moment, this isn't our kingdom, is it? In spiritual terms, we belong to the heavenly places in Christ. Our citizenship isn't in this world or of this world, but here we are, living here all the same. So how are we going to cope with that? How are the laws of God that we know and try to follow interacting with the laws of Babylon, which is still around us today? So that's the first thing we need to bear in mind. But let's also just have a look at how old Daniel and his friends were as the book opens, because I think that's also really helpful to you for one obvious reason. So look at verse 3 of chapter 1. It says that the king spake to Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel and of the king's seed and of the princes, children in whom was no blemish, but well favoured and skillful in all wisdom and cunning in knowledge and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. So did you see it in verse 4? It said children in whom was no blemish. It uses the word children, and the word means exactly that, but not little children. Daniel and his friends were the same age as many of you today. Mid to late teens is where they were. So in terms of role models for you today, in terms of teens, stuck somewhere where they might not want to be, trapped in a strange new world. I can't think of a better or more appropriate example than these friends. And what an example they are, not just to you, and not just to me and to your parents. They're an example to anybody who wants to live a life that pleases God. Now, there's a suggestion that Daniel was from Israel's royal family. That's what verse 3 seems to hint at, that what Nebuchadnezzar wanted was only the best Israel had from the king's seed, it says. Now, some people also claim that Daniel was related to Hezekiah. Now, I'm not sure we can prove that necessarily, but I'm sure that Hezekiah was a good king. And I'm sure his example would have been known and understood by Daniel. It might have been something that Daniel tried to emulate. But if it is the case that Daniel was related to him, then let's just look at how appropriate, but how inevitable it is that Daniel now finds himself where he does. And this is where you might want your pencils, because in your margin next to verse 3, you might want to write 2 Kings chapter 20. And we're going to look at a few verses here, because we know that Hezekiah was a great king, but he made a mistake. And his mistake is one that young people can tend to make. And to be fair, adults can struggle with this as well. Certainly, my 2 boys can sometimes be like this. And in 2 Kings 20, what we're going to find is that Hezekiah shows off. And worse than that, he shows off to the Babylonians. Now today, young people quite often take to social media to do this. They brag about what they have or what they're up to. When Hezekiah did this in front of Babylonians, that's right, the Babylonians, and he showed off all his treasures. And I'm very sure that the Babylonian envoy that you can see in that picture there, they thought to themselves, well, we'll have that, we'll have that, we'll have that when we come and conquer you. And sure enough, when Nebuchadnezzar did come and conquer Israel, he took those treasures that Hezekiah had and he put them in his own treasure house. But that wasn't the end of it. There was worse to come. If you look at verse 16 of 2 Kings 20, what does it say? It says, "And Isaiah said to Hezekiah, hear the word of the Lord. Behold, the days come, that all that is in thine house, and that which thy fathers have laid up in store unto this day, shall be carried into Babylon. Nothing shall be left, saith the Lord. And of thy sons that shall issue from thee, which thou shalt beget, shall they take away, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon." And where do we find Daniel and his friends today? There they are in the palace of the king of Babylon, exactly as Isaiah prophesied. So a little reminder to us that showing off can have real long-lasting consequences sometimes. But here's Daniel and his friends in Babylon, and they're going to become an outstanding example, and they're going to put that mistake right. When you read the book, you find that time and time again, Daniel and his friends are offered riches and treasures and honor and status for helping the kings they served, for making a stand for the truth. But they never show off. And they absolutely refuse to be captivated by the treasures of this world. And they did that because they knew they were different. They knew the truth. They knew who God was. They had respect for his principles. And the key thing is that they feared their heavenly Father more than they feared King Nebuchadnezzar or any of the other kings who ruled them. And that'll come out in our second study, especially. But this wasn't easy for them. They were the brightest, best looking, most intelligent, capable young people of their generation. A bit like all of you, no doubt. And they're taken from their homeland and they're dropped into one of the most incredible places the world's ever seen. When you research Babylon, you have to blink twice. It was like nothing that you can imagine. It had the greatest minds from across the world in it. That the very best universities, incredible beauty, amazing architecture and culture. The place was flooded with wealth. In other words, it had everything young people want. And in a sense, these boys did have the world at their feet as much as they were captives. They could have had some of that if they wanted. But they already had something better, something you and I have as well. They simply loved God. And this wasn't easy for them. And these friends only had each other. I don't think they had their much family in this strange land. I think they were eunuchs. That means that they couldn't get married. They couldn't have children. They really only had each other, and they really were in it together, and they cared for each other. And we really hope that is something you will do as well. It's so important that you do that as you grow up together, that your friends are like-minded and that they share your love and your commitment for the truth. There are fewer and fewer of us, and that makes you as a group all the more important, because if Jesus does remain away for a little while longer, you are the truth's future. So here they are then, in a class of talented individuals who the kings pulled together, that they're all eunuchs, assembled to make the king and his kingdom look as good as possible. He had their collective abilities put together, and they were totally controlled by the system that they were in. Their career options in life had been limited. That was deliberately done by Nebuchadnezzar. He wanted these young men to have no options other than to be the brains behind his wonderful kingdom and to reflect his glory. And verse 4 said they were going to be taught about the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. Now, we know the Chaldeans were incredibly clever. They come up again and again in the Bible record. Do you remember that Abraham was from Ur of the Chaldees? Most commentators suggest that Nebuchadnezzar himself was a Chaldean, so you can see why he's so keen to push this. And these people originally came from what we call Iraq today, down near Kuwait. They weren't Babylonians, they were something else. And there's lots and lots been written about them for you to research. They were very, very advanced. This practice of letting foreigners come to their schools to learn about all they knew seems to be something that happened in Babylon and Assyria. This was their policy when it came to ensuring that what they knew was passed to other people and other generations, and that this policy still happens today, doesn't it? It's called university. People from any country can come to the UK to learn alongside you. And they have been doing that up until the coronavirus. This was their way of influencing the world through what they knew. So for a small people, their impact on the world has been absolutely massive. They were seriously into science of all kinds. I'd probably call them the nerds of their day. They understood the natural world really well. They were into history, geography, they were into languages, economics and finance. The way they organized themselves is not unlike how we do it today in business. They were thousands of years ahead of their time. Let me give you a couple of examples that really show me how clever they were and proves their enduring influence over us today. And this all comes from a very old book, older than your parents and your grandparents and your great-grandparents even. And it's this one. It's called The Inspiration and Accuracy of the Holy Scriptures. And it's written by an historian called John Urquhart in 1895. And just look at what the Chaldeans are credited with when a discovery was made of some ancient stone tablets late in the 1800s. He's writing in this book about the book of Daniel. And he's using Daniel to argue how accurate Bible history is. But he mentions in the book the Chaldeans and what they learned about them when these ancient artifacts were found. But firstly, if I show you this image, I imagine most of you won't know who that is. And to be fair, not so the older ones would know who that is. But if I do that, maybe you've got a better idea. You know, this is Pythagoras. Now, he knew a thing or two about maths, didn't he? And that little equation that he came up with is still burned in my brain 23 years after I left school. And if you don't know it yet, you will soon. And Pythagoras was famous for more than just that equation, which led us to being able to construct wonderful buildings. He also invented a multiplication table that we use today. You can see an example of it there. The thing is, he had some help with that. Here's what Urquhart says about what the Chaldeans knew. He says that the library that they found contained many treatises on arithmetic, and the remains give us reason to think that Pythagoras borrowed the plan of his famous multiplication table from the Mesopotamian civilization. So this happened before Pythagoras came along. The Chaldeans were geniuses. But this wasn't all they worked out. But they also worked out something much more important, something much more useful to all of us today. And the book goes on to say this. There was also catalogues of astronomical observations. So they looked at the stars, they were into astronomy. And he goes on to say their knowledge of this science was of a very advanced kind. They were acquainted with the solar year of 365¼ days and invented the division of the circle into 360 degrees, and degrees into 60 minutes, and 60 minutes, and 60 minutes in the seconds into 60/3, which, along with the Babylonian signs for these divisions, are still retained by the science of the present time and are thus confessed to be incapable of improvement. So isn't that interesting? They worked out how long a year was, and the measures of time, the thing that has the greatest influence on us today, was discovered by this lot. Now, what that means then is that Daniel and his friends are going to be learning with some of the greatest minds mankind has ever seen, humanly speaking. And that's important later on. So despite the restrictions, what an opportunity for them. And the thing is, young people, it's the same for you. Today's world is no different. What the world does today is to put you into primary school and try to turn you into little geniuses. And then you go to secondary school to become bigger geniuses. And then when you've done that, the world says, well, why don't you come to university so we can make you masters of the universe? And at the same age, Daniel and his friends were being encouraged and put through a system to do this. Our world's the same. It's copying Babylon. It's got the same sort of system and the same desire to take you and give you its learning. So many universities are based in big cities with their bright lights and attractions, just like Babylon had. And there's nothing wrong with that in itself. Nothing wrong with the university. Lots of your parents went. I went. But if we're going to do that, or even if we choose to venture into the world of work after school, then we all need to get to the stage that Daniel and his friends were at in their minds. Because while they were young men in terms of years on this earth and in terms of experience in life, they had one important thing. They had absolute conviction in the truth. They were absolutely clear who Yahweh was. They were 100% aware they had to be different to some of the other very clever young people that they were now being pressed to spend time with. What they had, simply over and above their obvious intelligence, was an appetite for the truth. And what we're going to see now is just how important that was right from the beginning of their time in Babylon, and how that appetite kept them fed on godly things and what benefits that brought them. Okay, let's meet them, shall we? Daniel chapter 1, verse 5. It says, the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat and of the wine which he drank, for nourishing them 3 years, that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. Now among these were the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Now, did you see in verse 5 that it spoke about the daily provision? And these young men were very aware about what a daily provision was, weren't they? If any nation on earth knew about that phrase, it was the Jews. Why? Well, what happened in the wilderness in Moses' time? Well, you know, they were fed every day with manna, bread from heaven, weren't they? And the lesson of that was picked up by the Lord Jesus Christ. And he said this in Matthew's Gospel. He said, "It's written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God." And we know that because when you look at the word for what they were doing as they gathered the manna, the word manna just means what is it, doesn't it? But the word gathered that describes what they were doing is the Hebrew word for word. So they went out and gathered the daily word every day. That's one of the reasons we have a daily reading planner. It's to help keep us fed on God's word. But this was about control, wasn't it? Nebuchadnezzar wanted to control everything about these boys' lives now. And did you notice in verse 5, it's going to take 3 years to get them ready. Funny that, isn't it? Most university degrees are 3 years, aren't they? You see, the world's just the same as Babylon. Now, these portions that these friends were being presented with caused them issues straight away, because what they were given was the king's meat, or the king's food, it really means, and the wine that the king drank. Nebuchadnezzar has already made sure they won't be having children. There'll be no royal seed from any of this group of young men. No one's going to be challenging me, is his plan. And now he's done that, he's putting them through a 3-year boot camp where he's absolutely determined to stamp them with his stamp, to make sure that when people see them, they know who they belong to. But that wasn't a new idea either, was it? Daniel and his friends would understand that concept as well, because that's what God effectively did with the Levites. Earlier in the Old Testament, in Leviticus 21, you read that chapter, you'll see that he took that tribe and he made them his servants. And they had to be perfect and without blemish and eat his food, because they were supposed to be reflecting his glory. And Nebuchadnezzar is trying to do the same thing. And he's saying, I'm not just king, I'm like a god. And you group of bright young things are going to be made in my image. So can you see how dangerous this was for these 4 friends? Nebuchadnezzar says, you're going to be brought up for 3 years in my training school. And why he does that is at the end of verse 5, that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. So he does that in order that when he looks at them, he sees reflected back at him his own brilliance. He was looking for a family likeness. Now that's how it will be when Jesus comes back. Those of us who are baptized all have to stand before him, we're told. But we stand there for him to look and see if we resemble him in some small way. And the brilliance of this story is that Daniel and his friends do end up standing before King Nebuchadnezzar, but they're nothing like him. They finish their 3 years of learning at the top of the class, but they're not like their classmates. They stand before Nebuchadnezzar, and as we'll see, they're known by their Hebrew names. Lots of you have Bible names too, but even if you don't, what we really want is for you all to follow in their example, to follow in their footsteps, so that one day we can all stand before the real King of the whole earth as well, and be recognized as his. And you see, Daniel and his friends really were in it together, and they got through it together because they had an appetite for the truth over and above anything that Nebuchadnezzar wanted. And in verse 6 we saw their names, didn't we? Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael and Azariah. Now those are their Hebrew names, and we know from verse 7 that they're then given Chaldean or Babylonian names. The master plan Nebuchadnezzar had to control these young men and their minds started with the basic fundamental thing that identifies us, our names. And did you see who it was who named them? It was the chief of the eunuchs. It wasn't the king himself. He left this job up to someone else. And there was a reason he chose the names he did. And it's not a good reason as far as we're concerned, or as far as these friends were concerned. Because just turn over to chapter 4 in Daniel for a moment and have a look at what it tells us there. Because here it tells us where those names came from and what those names represented, or at least the idea behind them. Daniel chapter 4, and look at verse 8. It says, "But at the last Daniel came in before me, whose name was Belteshazzar, according to the name of my God." So here's these 4 teenagers brought to a strange land, and the first thing that happens is that someone comes along and gives them a new name. And the person who gives them those names was the prince of the eunuchs, who was probably a eunuch himself, which means that these friends are given a Chaldean or Babylonian name from someone who is sterile. They were names that were therefore going to be going nowhere. They weren't family names in the sense of something that was going to be passed on to another generation. I'm sure you've got this already, but Daniel means God is judge, or God is my judge. And his name, as we saw there, changed to Belteshazzar, and that means something like keeper of the hid treasures of Bel. And that's ironic, isn't it, really, for Daniel, because his ancestor Hezekiah had shown the hidden treasures of God off, hadn't he? Hananiah is the next one, and his name means God has favoured, or God is gracious, and he was given the name Shadrach, which means inspiration of the sun. Mishael means who is what God is, or who is like Ale, and his name is changed to Meshach, which means he who belongs to Sheshach, who is another god. And lastly, we have Azariah, whose name's hidden behind my picture, I think, but his name means Yahweh has helped. He becomes Abednego, or servant of the shining fire, which will be very relevant in our next study, won't it? But the point is this: these names are meaningless, aren't they, to these 4 friends? They're all dead ends. They talk about human gods or human ideals, but their Jewish names all included the name of the living God, he who will be, not the one who doesn't exist or the one who doesn't matter, he who will be. And they never forgot the name that was in them. And we have to try and be the same, because the name of God is going into eternity, and it will be everywhere. And they lived up to their name, and they knew exactly what was happening and exactly what was being done to them. And look at how committed and how determined they were to not losing the promise that their Hebrew names hinted at. Look at verse 8 of chapter 1 in Daniel. It says, "But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself." So he and his friends purposed in their hearts, right in the center of their being, they said, we aren't letting go of our principles here. You see, whoever taught them in Israel did a good job, didn't they? Even though there were very few in the land at that time who actually loved God. Somebody taught these friends how to love Yahweh. And it's the same today, isn't it? There are very few who love God. That's the job of your parents and your uncles and your aunts and your ecclesias. That's what we try to do with you in Sunday school and CYC and youth weekends, which I know you're missing really badly right now. We try to show you the wonders of the truth because we want you to feel the truth in your hearts. Because we know that when you love the truth, it matters so much less what the world wants from you. When the world wants you to eat and drink with it, we as your parents can be comforted that in your hearts, you know what's right. Now, I don't think that the actual food was the issue here, because elsewhere in the book, For example, at the start of chapter 10, Daniel talks about that he hadn't eaten meat or he hadn't drunk any wine or pleasant bread, as he puts it, for 3 weeks. And he'd done that on purpose. So what that tells us is that usually he did have those things in later life. So they did eat those things. It wasn't that they couldn't. In chapter 1, I think this is a religious thing that they're doing. What they rejected was the principle of being made in the king's image. They rejected being powered and energized through the things that sustain Nebuchadnezzar. Yes, we know that the Jews had very clear dietary rules and regulations. We know that. We know what kosher food is. But what's happening here is that they had an appetite for staying Yahweh's children, not becoming Nebuchadnezzar's. And I think that they put what they put into their mouths was something they felt they could control. They wanted to be driven by the power of God. And at the same age as you are now, they were absolutely clear they were not going to be defiled. And that's why they're a great example to all of us. Just have a look at how that decision is rewarded as far as God is concerned. Verse 9, now God had brought Daniel into favour and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. So how does that happen? How did this happen? Why weren't Daniel and his friends marked as troublemakers right from the beginning, and even harsher sanctions put on them to make them conform? If I was the prince of the eunuchs, that's what I might well have done. Not here, though. So how did they do it? We know that God helped them, but what did they do? And how did they do it? Because if we can grasp this, then I promise you it's something you will be able to benefit from in the future. Well, come with me to Proverbs chapter 16, because the answer is all in how we conduct ourselves. It's the spirit that we do things in. And in Proverbs chapter 16, which is what we read in verse 7. Proverbs 16, verse 7, it says, when a man's ways please the Lord, he maketh even his enemies to be at peace with him. So that's interesting, isn't it? Yeah. If we try to please God first and foremost, then even our enemies want to be on good terms with us. But how do we do that? Well, just come back a few more pages in Proverbs to chapter 3, because here's the attitude these three friends had. Chapter 3 and verse 3. It says, let not mercy and truth forsake thee. Bind them about thy neck, write them upon the table of thine heart. So shalt thou find favour and good understanding in the sight of God and man. So one of the things we need to realise is that sometimes we can please both man and God in standing for a principle, in standing for what's right. And that expression here applies to Daniel, it applies to Samuel, it applies to the Lord Jesus Christ. They were all individuals who grew in favour with God and man, it says. And the thing that set them apart was their spirit. They understood truth and they understood mercy and they did the right thing in the right way. So that means when they stood for the right thing, they pleased and honoured God. And when they went and did it in the right way, they pleased man. Daniel and his friends made a stand and said, we're not going to be defiled and compromised. And because of the way they did it, they were loved for it. Verse 9 says that that the way Daniel did this led the prince of the eunuchs, to being able to do anything other than just love him. Loving kindness, that expression means there, that tender love that Daniel was shown was loving kindness, sort of godly love almost. The chief of the eunuchs was probably as hard and as uncompromising as they came usually. Daniel and his friends melted his heart through the power of the truth. But there was a problem, wasn't there? Look at verse 10. The prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who hath appointed your meat and your drink. For why should he see your faces worse liking the children which are of your sort? Then shall ye make me endanger my head to the king. And you can see his problem, can't you? It wasn't just about eating and drinking what the king did. It was about doing so that they looked like the king. You know, the prince of the eunuch can't go to Nebuchadnezzar and say, just to let you know, O king, there's 4 children of Israel who don't want to be like you. You know, he knew what would happen if he did that. And I do wonder if there was another problem here that perhaps is an even bigger problem. You see, I think the prince of the eunuchs wasn't just aware of the king's disapproval of what Daniel wanted. There was another problem. Did you spot what it said towards the end of verse 10? He says, why should he see your faces worse liking than the children which are of your sort? There's the problem. That word sort there is the word continuance or circle, if you look in your margin, if you've got one. Some translations say, why should your faces look worse than those in your age group? But Young's literal translation says this, well, why doth he see your faces sadder than those of the lads which are of your circle? And I think he's talking about their religious circle. And he's saying to Daniel and his friends, not all of your religious circle want the same thing. We know from the start of the chapter that this group was made up of captives from Israel, not just Daniel and his 3 friends. There were others from Israel. And some of those captives were not supporting Daniel and his friends. And we know that because verse 17 says that only these 4 children are singled out by God and blessed and given knowledge and skill. So can you see, in a sense, this is like a group of young Christadelphians being taken into Babylon, but only 4 of them stood up for what was right. This is tricky, isn't it? The prince of the eunuchs says, I hear you, Daniel, and I love you, Daniel, but the rest of your religious circle, they're eating and drinking what we're giving them. Where's the consistency? And it's really tricky for you young people too. The world is the most subtle place it's ever been. And it's so hard to make a stand for what's right. It's even harder if those who should be joining you in making a stand don't do it with you. That's why we're so keen to help you find the truth and store it in your hearts together. It's why we're trying our best to give you frequent opportunities to be together. We want you to grow together. We want you to realize that you are in it together, because you will need each other if Christ remains away. You can stand together side by side, as these 4 did here. Now, the fact that they got a no didn't stop their principles winning out. Look at verse 11. Then said Daniel to Melzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, prove thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days, and let them give us pulse to eat and water to drink. Then let our countenances be looked upon before thee, and the countenance of the children that eat of the portion of the king's meat, and as thou seest, deal with thy servants. Now, when you read that for the first time, you might think he's not right in doing this. You can see he's trying to find a loophole. You could read it a little bit like one of my boys getting a no from me in doing what they want, but then they go and ask their mum to see if they get a yes. That doesn't work, by the way, boys. I know you're watching. But Daniel and his friends do it in a very respectful way. And they're so determined and earnest in what they do. They get a no initially, but that didn't mean they left it there. They didn't think, oh, well, we tried. It's just one of those things. I suppose we'll have to go and eat this fabulous steak and drink this great wine. You know, that was the easy way out for them, wasn't it? They had the perfect excuse to drop it. And they had the perfect excuse because the rest of their youth circle was the same. But they knew they couldn't take the easy way out. and neither can we, because living in the truth means effort. I'm afraid it means doing things that sometimes we'd rather not. So they find someone they know will listen, someone who's perhaps got less to lose than the prince of the eunuchs, and they come and they say, please help us just on a trial basis, just for a few days. Give us a vegan diet. That's what they wanted, a simple diet based on the stuff that grew out of the ground. And it's ironic that vegan diets are a big thing today, isn't it? He says in verse 12, give us pulse, give us vegetables. Stuff grown from seeds is what they wanted, natural and good, like it was right at the beginning of creation. Now, this is a gamble, isn't it? It's faith at work, because they don't know if they're right or not. They don't know if God will bless the stand they're making, and that this simple diet they're asking for will make them look healthier than the others. They make the same gamble in our next study as well. We'll look at that later. But the point is, they made the stand for the right reason in the right way. And we know what happens, don't we? Verse 14. So he consented to them in this matter and proved them 10 days. And at the end, their countenance appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat. Thus Melzar took away the portion of their meat and the wine that they should drink and gave them pulse. So they looked visibly different at the end of those 10 days. Healthier, rosier, not necessarily fatter, as it says there. They were just better nourished. And the lesson's so clear, isn't it? If you delight to feed yourself in the right things, then you will be different. It's as true in your spiritual life as it is in your natural life. It will change you if your appetite is full of stuff, this book. And the other lesson is that having less didn't hurt them. We live in a world that wants to give us more and more and more. But in having less than everybody else did, they're showing us that it's what you have that's important, not just the quantity. Now, I'm not sure how popular they were when their youth circle found out that all the steak and the wine they'd been enjoying had been replaced by veggies, but they set an incredible example for those who should have been doing the same as them. And you can do that for each other as well, can't you? Even remotely, you can do it. Growing up isn't easy. Growing up in the truth in today's world is even harder, I think. But just take a look at how setting the example in this way benefited them. Look at verse 17. As for these children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom. Did you see the one important word there? It's the word you need to underline or colour in. It's the word all. All learning and wisdom. So do you see what happened? They made a stand for the truth, and God blessed them with all learning and wisdom. Well, wasn't that what they were there for? For Nebuchadnezzar to teach them that? But that's not what happens, is it? God is the one who teaches them. And standing for the truth actually meant they got on better in life than those who didn't. It didn't hurt their job prospects. In fact, it was just the opposite. That if you take the time to talk to your older brothers and sisters in your meetings, when we eventually get back there, God willing, they will tell you how true that can be. Following the truth makes your future bright. And these four learn a whole lot more than what the Chaldeans had to teach them. And you're the same. All your worldly learning is necessary to get you grown up and ready for work and life as an adult. But it will never be as important or as powerful or as life-altering as what you learn at the weekends in Sunday school or Bible class or CYC or youth weekends. God gave them all learning and wisdom, not part of it. He equipped them for the life that lay ahead of them, and he can do that for you. He certainly helped me. I've got absolutely no doubt about that. And look at what happens next in verse 18. At the end of the days that the king had said he should bring them in, then the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king communed with them, and among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore stood they before the king. So the moment has come. 3 years of training, 3 years of living in the image of the king, being prepared to reflect his glory, and Nebuchadnezzar's very excited and keen to meet them. And I'm sure it was like an interview, as this group of nervous young men would stand before him, the most powerful man in the world at that time, as he asks them some tricky questions. And I'm sure he was impressed with what he saw. But he's drawn to a little group of 4 friends. They are nothing like the rest of the puppets in the royal court. There was none found like them, it says. And who are they? Well, they aren't Belteshazzar or Shadrach or Meshach or Abednego. Among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. There they are, whole and intact, and they went in as Hebrews, and they came out as Hebrews, because they had an appetite for the truth. They had an appetite for loving God and preserving what he wanted in everything that they did. They didn't come out as Chaldeans or Babylonians. Yes, they absorbed all the learning, but their higher learning in things of the truth was what they loved more. They learned the truth first and understood that everything else came second. Let's come to Romans chapter 6, so I can show you what I think had happened to them and what we so desperately want for you. Romans chapter 6 is that chapter that we know really well because it's all about baptism into Christ. In chapter 6 and verse 17, what we've got here are our 4 friends. Romans 6 verse 17. It says, "But God be thanked that ye were the servants of sin, but ye have obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine which was delivered you." That's what they did. They purposed in their heart not to be defiled. Why? Well, because they'd received the doctrine of the truth. And the idea there in the Greek, where it talks about that form of doctrine, means a mold. It means the mold of doctrine into which you were put or you were cast. We want to come out in the image of the Lord Jesus Christ. These friends came out Hebrews. They weren't altered, despite Nebuchadnezzar's best attempts. And when they stood before him, they still had their Hebrew names. And those names were like a beacon. Now, I'm sure Nebuchadnezzar didn't realize that, but standing before him in those 4 boys with their 4 Hebrew names was the absolute witness to the greatness of the real King of heaven and earth. Just think about it to know how true that was. You can see on the screen a reminder of those names. God is my judge, Yahweh is gracious, who is like God, and Yahweh has helped us. It's almost like a sentence, isn't it? It summarizes the wonderful character and the power of God. And that was what these 4 friends had in their lives. They had an excellent spirit. They had God's characteristics in the things they said and did. They were loved for it, and they were rewarded for it. At the same age many of you are now, that the truth was molded in their lives, and it was something they never lost. Just come back to Daniel chapter 1 and just look at verse 20 to see how much of a difference it made to them. It was enormous, the difference that it made. Chapter 1 verse 20, "And in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in all his realm." 10 times better they were. Have you ever wondered why it was 10 times? Why wasn't it 20 times or 30 times or 50 times or 100 times? Well, the answer to that's an easy one, isn't it? And you already know it, even if you don't realize you do. The reason they were 10 times better is because they had spent 10 days being tested in their appetite for the truth. Can you see that? For every day they sat there and ate their simple meals, over those 10 days, they became 1 times better for each day. Can you see how God works? They expressed faith in their God and he responded. And for each day they made that stand, they were rewarded. It might have taken 3 years to see the reward, but God responded and blessed them. All because they loved him and because they had an appetite for the truth. Young people, I think we really need to think about their example. God has given you talents and skills and abilities, and they're developing all the time as you're growing up. But you now realize, don't you, that Babylon wants those talents as well, just like it did in Daniel's day. And we have to be really careful, because the world will flatter you because of your abilities. It'll desire you because you are polite, you're responsible, you know right from wrong, and you have principles and you show respect. It'll spot that and it will crave it. And it can so easily mean that we get carried along with it, that we let it make us feel great. But please don't ever forget that God wants your abilities even more, and for a purpose which is far more important. You have to decide what's important to you. Is it the world's learning? Is it the bright lights and all the trappings that Babylon can give you? You see, Daniel and his friend realized that Babylon wouldn't last forever. And the world that you've grown up in won't last forever either. In many ways, the world's already creaking to an end, isn't it? So the challenge is, are you determined and purposed to hold something in your hearts like these 4 friends? 4 friends who held the love of God so strongly and so deeply that even the greatest human king and all his considerable powers of persuasion and clever learning couldn't overcome. So let's leave our thoughts for the first half there, and when we come back, we'll see how it wasn't long before these friends needed to make another stand for the truth, a very public stand, one that literally threatened their lives. And we'll see some brilliant lessons from that study as well.